When building a web page, it's considered good practice to do the layout and positioning of your HTML elements before working on their visual styling. Think of building a house. After all, you don't paint it first. Instead, you start with the foundation and structure. I'm going to take you through the process of building my HTML structure and positioning the elements so that you can follow along and note the placement of key elements for display. For this project, I chose the Little Lemon restaurant as the client persona. I've opened Visual Studio Code and I've created my index.html file with the semantic HTML document structure based on the barebones layout from week 1. In my semantic structure, I used the header element for the logo, the nav element for the navigation bar, the main element for the main page content, and the footer element for the footer. The navigation bar uses an unordered list for the navigation links. In the main element, I set up 2 section elements, one for each row of the content. Each row is its own element, so I can use a flexbox layout to split the content into the required number of columns. I use the article element to represent each column. This is because the content of each column will be self-contained and not related to the other columns. I use a similar approach for splitting the footer into 2 columns, except instead of using the article element for columns, I use a div element. This is because, semantically, the footer content should be considered as a whole, and additionally, it isn't important content for search engines and accessibility software. Since I want to split the footer visually into 2 columns, I use the div element to allow for the flexbox layout. I save the file and open the web page in the web browser. The content is displaying on the web page, but I need to lay out and position the elements using CSS. I go back to Visual Studio Code and open styles.css in the CSS folder on the left. I already set up some rules for the body and heading elements. I decided to use REM as the unit of measurement for this project, so the font sizes, margins, and padding properties of my CSS rules will all be REM values. The only exception to this rule is the body element, where the left and right margins are set to 5% of the window size. Let's start by adding a rule to center the logo. I use an element selector to select the image element that is a descendant of the header element. I then apply 3 CSS properties to the CSS rule. First, I set the display property to block, so that the element changes from an inline element to a block level element. Then, I set the margin left and margin right properties to auto. These 3 properties together will center the logo inside of the header element. Next, I need to lay out the navigation menu horizontally. To do this, I add an element selector to select the unordered list element that is a descendant of the nav element. I then apply 2 CSS properties to the CSS rule. First, I set the list style property to none to remove the bullet point at the beginning of each element. Then I set the text align property to center the inline elements. Next, I add another CSS rule. This time, the selector will select the list item element that is a descendant of the nav element. I then apply the display property and set its value to inline block. I save the file and open the web page in the web browser. So far, so good. Both the logo and the navigation bar are centered. Next, I need to set up the flexbox layout. I add another CSS rule using the element selector to select the section element. I then add the display property and set its value to flex. Next, I add the CSS rule using the element selector to select the article element. I then set the flex property to 1. I save the file and open the web page in the web browser. Now the main content is laid out correctly, with 1 column in the first row and 3 columns in the second row. Finally, I'll set the layout for the footer. First, I add a CSS rule using the element selector to select the footer element. I then add the display property and set its value to flex. Then I add another CSS rule. This time the selector will select the div element that is a descendant of the footer element. I then set the flex property to 1. I save the file again and open the web page in the web browser. Success! The web page elements are now laid out and positioned correctly. Laying out and positioning your HTML elements first will always save you time later on when you begin applying visual improvements and animations. Doing it this way means that your web page has a good, strong foundational layout to work from, and to which you can add the paint and decor, the visual styling of your web page. Take some time to practice building your HTML structure and setting up the positioning of your elements.